I got the request to upload a lecture on the Harrod-Domar growth model, which I'm happy to do. And I based this lecture on the book by Aghion and Howitt from 2009, The Economics of Growth. The point of departure for this video is that we already know the seminal contribution of Solow's growth model that he published in 1956. And which basically clarified the role that capital accumulation and technological progress have for economic growth of a certain country in the long run and for the convergence of per capita GDP and income across different countries. Before the Solow growth model was published, however, there was an earlier growth model called the Harrod-Domar growth model that goes back to the contributions of Roy Harrod from 1939 and F.C. Domar from 1946. And this contribution actually made us believe that capital accumulation alone can sustain economic growth. And in the following, I outlined the basic mechanisms of their model and also the central and crucial critiques that the framework has received. For simplicity, I omit time indices in the mathematical notation from now on. I think the most important point to start with is the production side of the economy that is basically characterized by a Leontief production function that has the form that output, which is also equal to income in the economy, is a function of physical capital used in the production process and employment, denoted by L. And the Leontief production function states that output is then the minimum of effective capital input and effective labor input. So the two production factors, capital and labor, are perfect complements. So whenever the product of capital and its productivity is higher than the product of labor and its productivity, then the additional capital, that is the surplus capital over and above the amount of effective labor, cannot be used for production. So you need a certain amount of capital and a certain amount of labor to produce an additional unit of output. In this case here, producing one extra unit of output requires exactly 1 divided by A units of additional capital and 1 divided by B units of labor. So whenever A times K is not equal to B times L, then, as I said, there is a surplus of the abundant factor, the one that is in more abundant supply. And this factor then, or at least the surplus of this factor, it cannot be used for production, sits idle, and cannot be compensated, so it does not earn an income. The other production factor is then the limiting factor, the one that limits the production process. And a reasonable case to consider, as long as you observe unemployment, is that the product of productivity of capital multiplied with the capital stock is smaller than the productivity of labor multiplied by the number of workers, because in this case you would have unemployment, so there would be surplus labor, and this production factor would sit idle, at least partly. So Harrod and Domar consider this case, and then the production function that we've seen here basically implies that output is equal to A times K. So that's what we see here. Output, which is equal to income, is equal to A times K. From the household side, the economy is assumed to be closed and there is no government. And therefore, as I already mentioned, output is equal to income. And investment in such an economy is also equal to savings, that we also already know from the Solow growth model. And then we have again the behavioral assumption that households save a constant fraction of income. So aggregate savings would be equal to aggregate income multiplied by the saving rate. That's aggregate saving, which is equal to aggregate investment. And also in the Harrod-Domar model, of course, capital depreciates and the rate of depreciation is delta. So with these assumptions, the capital stock then accumulates according to the equation that we have here. K dot is again the time derivative of the capital stock. So it is the change of the capital stock over time. And the capital stock changes in a positive way by having more investment, so saving. So then the capital stock increases. and it decreases with the depreciation rate, so the amount of capital that depreciates. Again, as in other models, you would have that the capital stock decreases, so the time derivative is negative whenever depreciation is higher than gross investment, and the capital stock accumulates, so K dot is positive, whenever gross investment is higher than depreciation. And then we can plug in the production function from the previous slide, this AK production function here, into this equation, and then we get the capital accumulation equation for the Harrod-Domar model. Now, one important thing to note already here is that there are no dynamics that would ensure a convergence to a steady state. So we don't have the same as in the Solow model, where if the capital stock accumulates, the marginal product of capital decreases and therefore gross investment decreases as well because the gross investment curve is concave. Here this is not the case, and here it could in principle be that this part here, so gross investment, always exceeds depreciation, right? So you would have perpetual capital accumulation in this case, and no forces would ensure convergence to the steady state. Also the other way around, if the gross investment is lower than depreciation, you would basically see the capital stock decline to zero without any force that would drive the saving rate up. So the marginal product of capital would not increase in this case. Now we put things together. We know the production function for the case in which capital is the limiting production factor is this AK production function here. And A is constant, B would also be constant, so the productivity of capital and the productivity of labor is assumed to be constant in the Harrod-Domar framework. From that it follows immediately that the growth rate of aggregate output, which is also the growth rate of aggregate income, is the same as the growth rate of aggregate capital, because A stays constant, and you can easily check that in this case it would follow that the two growth rates are the same. So take the logarithm and then take the derivative with respect to time, and you will find this to be true. So then we have the growth rate of aggregate income is the same as the growth rate of aggregate capital, and we know the growth rate of aggregate capital from the previous slide, from the capital accumulation equation, if we divide it by K. Then the growth rate would be the saving rate multiplied by the productivity of capital minus the rate of depreciation. And that implies that the economic growth rate at the aggregate level would be higher if the saving rate is higher, or if the productivity of capital is higher, or if the depreciation rate is lower, because then we subtract a lower amount here. However, we are typically interested in the growth rate of per capita output or per worker output, and not so much at the growth rate of aggregate output. So we divide by the population size, which is also the labor force in the model. And then per capita income and per capita output would be A times K over L. And again, you can check by taking the logarithm and the derivative with respect to time that the growth rate of per capita output or per capita income would be the difference between the growth rate of aggregate output here and the population growth rate or the growth rate of the labor force. So we note that in this case the economy can grow, or per capita GDP can grow, if capital is the limiting production factor and capital accumulation is faster than growth of the labor force. So in this case we would have a constant growth rate of per capita GDP and per capita income. So therefore the economy could grow. However, this cannot last in the long run, because at some point capital would become the abundant production factor. So then at some point there would be the total labor force would be employed, there wouldn't be any unemployment anymore, and then employment would become the limiting production factor. And in this case, our growth in per capita GDP would fall to zero. And this leads us directly to the problems of the Harrod-Domar model and to the types of criticism that have been brought forward against it. So first and foremost, the Harrod-Domar model cannot account for an increasing per capita income or increasing per capita GDP in the long run as we would observe it, because it only implies per capita GDP growth as long as capital is the limiting production factor, but the growth rate of capital is greater than the growth rate of the number of workers. But if this is the case, then by implication, at some point capital has to become the abundant factor. And from this point onwards, the per capita income growth rate would be zero, and there wouldn't be any long-run economic growth anymore. The second point is that the marginal product of capital does not change with the accumulation of physical capital. And that's perhaps by itself a problematic assumption, because we would naturally assume that if there is more capital, then the marginal product would fall, and if there is less capital, the marginal product of capital would rise. So that follows from intuition quite a lot. If you hold the number of employees constant and you increase capital, then the additional output should converge to zero at some point, and the opposite holds true if you have less and less capital. But it also implies that there is no convergence in the model. So we don't have any force that would imply stability of the long-run balanced growth path, so that the economy would converge to such a long-run balanced growth path. Instead, we would have an unstable growth path that would change whenever the saving rate changes, and there is no force that brings the saving rate back to a level that would ensure a constant growth rate. And this is not in line with the stylized facts. You can watch the video on the stylized facts of economic growth, where we've observed over the last 200 years rather stable and constant per capita GDP growth in line with the Calder stylized facts. So the model does not fulfill the Calder stylized facts, and it also goes against the empirical finding of conditional convergence. Conditional convergence is found empirically, but the Harrod-Domar model would not predict it. So overall, the Harrod-Domar model is not consistent with the stylized facts. It's not consistent with main empirical tests of growth models, and it also cannot really account for long-run economic growth. Overall, as a summary, the Harrod-Domar model was an early attempt to explain long-run economic growth. It was then displaced by the Solow growth model, because the Solow growth model did not have the same shortcomings. The Solow growth model is consistent with convergence. It has a decreasing marginal product of capital if capital increases, and an increasing marginal product of capital if capital decreases. It has equilibrating mechanisms that are consistent with the balanced growth path and with the empirical data. And for all these reasons, basically, the Solow model was the one that was in the end superior. However, the Harrod-Domar model resembles some properties of the AK growth model. We will see the AK growth model later on. And it is still often used in the context of development economics, because in many low-income countries it could reasonably be that capital is a limiting production factor, and in these cases the model may fit quite well, so you can motivate development assistance by the Harrod-Domar model. But we see in another video on the overlapping generations model with poverty traps that you can do the same in a model in which you have a neoclassical type of production function. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you found it interesting and useful. For more economic content, please visit my channel that you see on the left-hand side here, or follow one of the closely related videos that you see on the right-hand side.